The relationship between insight and creativity. One of the most enduring theories of creativity is the Wallace model of creativity. It begins with the preparation stage where the individual properly identifies and defines the problem, and then proceeds to gather information necessary to solve the problem. Next comes incubation, which involves taking some time away from a problem to allow the unconscious mind to process the information to produce a solution. This is the state where information is assimilated, and remote associations are thought to be formed. The third stage in the Wallace model is illumination, or more commonly referred to as insight because it results in the familiar aha experience. During this stage, a solution suddenly emerges into consciousness, like a light bulb being turned on. This sudden illumination is still controversial, however. Weisberg wrote, "There seems very little reason to believe that solutions to novel problems come about in leaps of insight. At every step of the way, the process involves small movements away from what is known." p. 50. Perhaps we only perceive it as sudden because the processing that led up to the insight is below conscious awareness. Prominent creativity researcher Sawyer suggests insights only seem sudden because we didn't notice the many incremental steps, or mini insights, that immediately preceded it. He suggests rather than the familiar light bulb turning on metaphor, perhaps the tip of an iceberg or final brick in the wall is more appropriate. The final stage was verification. At that point, the individual tests the idea or applies the solution. Although the 4 stages of the creative process included in the Wallace model are generally accepted to be accurate, it is generally accepted that the creative process is much more recursive than the linear Wallace model is depicted as being. It is worth noting that while other models have dissected the 4 stages of the Wallace model into further stages, the fundamental 4 of the Wallace model still remain. With respect to the second stage of the Wallace stage model of creativity, namely incubation, one of the oldest observations in the psychology of creativity is that a creative idea is often preceded by a period of unconscious incubation. There is much research studying the incubation effect and its relationship with creative insight. It is generally agreed upon that there exists an incubation effect, although the exact nature of the associated unconscious processes remains uncertain. Hypotheses include mental relaxation, selective forgetting, random subconscious recombination, and spreading activation. The relationship between insight and creativity is still a controversial one. Whether insight is a component of creativity, or a component of the creative process, simply a form of problem solving that may or may not produce a creative solution to a given problem, or something else entirely is as yet unanswered. Experimental and theoretical work support conflicting views regarding this question. Sternberg and Davidson conceptualized creativity as the ability to change existing thinking patterns, producing something that is useful, novel and generative. One cannot help but notice similarities between this conception of creativity and the generally accepted definition of insight, namely a reorganization of the elements of a person's mental representation of a stimulus, situation or event to yield a non-obvious or non-dominant interpretation. Thus, it is likely that both conceptions are correct. We know from experience that insight is not always involved in creative problem solving and therefore must not be a necessary component of it. Creative solutions can also arise through a conscious, deliberate analysis of the problem. Creativity and insight have similar neurological correlates as well. Deliberate creativity that results from analysis is primarily controlled by the prefrontal cortex. However, creativity that comes as a sudden flash of insight involves 3 brain regions, namely the temporal, occipital, and parietal, TOP. Moreover, a prominent view of creativity is that it is based on the processing of remote or loose connections between ideas. Research suggests the brain's right hemisphere is primarily responsible for the processing of remote associations and the brain's left hemisphere is responsible for the processing of close or obvious associations. Research suggests it is this rightward asymmetry that allows for weak activation of a broad semantic field, thus allowing for non-dominant, remote associations between disparate ideas to take place. Hence the Bowden and Beeman theory seems to provide a neurological basis for Mednick's theory of creativity.